it was more just being a good listener. Instead of trying to describe, oh, what WalkMe is, it's like, no. You tell me your day to day, and then we figure out if even we're a good solution for you, to be honest. Like, we don't want to be forcing this. I'm not a salesperson in the sense that there's no commission here. I wish. But my whole goal is that you see the value enough that you want to work with me.
Welcome to Change Enablers, a podcast by Tango. Sit back, relax, and listen to some of the brightest minds in operations and enablement.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Change Enablers podcast. I am super pumped today to have Matt Belli, who's the global IT product owner for digital adoption at Nestlé. Matt's calling in from Milan, Italy, where actually the previous 2 weeks he spent in Paris at the Olympics. I'm very jealous. Would love to do an entire podcast just based on that. But we're going to talk more about digital adoption. Matt leads a lot of the efforts at Nestlé around WalkMe, enabling over 200 applications within Nestlé's expansive global organization. I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about that. But there's some really exciting stuff that we're going to dig into around process adoption, data, being kind of this internal salesperson and stakeholder for teams to maximize their output and efficiency. There's a lot of really cool stuff. I got introduced to Matt a while back, learned a lot from him, and I'm excited for the audience to learn a lot from him as well. So Matt, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Happy to be here.
So why don't we start with just talking a little bit about your career trajectory, how you ended up at Nestlé, and sort of your job responsibilities today?
Sure. Yeah. Honestly, it started with a bit of luck. Like, as you said, it's a big change from when I was living, back in the Bay Area, back in California. So basically, how I got here was July of 2020, honestly, which was kind of a rough period. We're in the middle of COVID. And at that point was when a recruiter from Nestle reached out. And it was basically just like, well, we have this awesome opportunity if you are willing to relocate to Milan. And I'm like, wait a second, we're talking middle of COVID, switching continents, going to Milan, which is kind of one of the worst places to be at the time. And I decided, long story short, I decided let's go for it. It took me another like 6 months or so to get over there with all the visa paperwork and things like that. But things are going really well. Things are great with Nestlé. I really see the potential for what we've done with the program. To give a little background, before I joined, they were only live on one application. And part of the reason they were trying to expand the team with my background with WalkMe was that essentially they were in the process of negotiating the enterprise license. So basically to put WalkMe on all applications. So that was sort of the impetus to bring me on. And that's sort of how I started. And then...
So that's fascinating. So you were at WalkMe at the time. Correct.
Yeah, honestly, I wasn't even trying to leave. I wasn't even looking. It was a recruiter who reached out on LinkedIn, especially at that time period. I was figuring, I can't move. I can't switch jobs. Like COVID, everything is changing. Yeah, it was a big surprise, honestly.
So you went from WalkMe to Nestlé to help Nestlé with their WalkMe instance, which was only live on one application. Eventually, it would be live on 200 applications. That's super fascinating. So you kind of saw it go from 1 to 200. Talk to me a little bit about, Nestlé internally, and assume that the audience doesn't know anything about Nestlé, even though I'm sure we all know about chocolate chips and different products and maybe hot chocolate and things like that. But talk to me a little bit about Nestlé as an organization. Why digital adoption was something that was top of mind for them, and kind of the status of where that sits today and the applications that you enable. I know you can't mention all of them, but give some background on Nestlé.
So this is an interesting question because, to be honest, I don't think they were even really looking for digital adoption. To be honest, most people, and a large part of what I do is telling people about what is digital adoption. And so let me back up a little bit. And so like when I was at WalkMe, I held a few different positions over the years where I was, an engineer, I was a customer success manager, I was an enablement manager. So I could basically build content, I could tell a value story, and I could enable teams to build content. So I was like, okay, I got everything checked. This is all I need that Nestle could imagine wanting. And then I get there, and there's a couple teams bought into the idea of digital adoption. Like we started on Success Factors, so that was the first app. So the ITHR team understood the value that was there, but that was it. And so that's sort of was a big shock for me because, and if you think about those three roles that I had previously, those are all post-sales roles. Like people have already bought in and are literally paying me to come up with strategies to deliver value. This is a whole new beast where, especially from the size perspective, as you mentioned, I'm familiar with a small, mid-sized company. I mean, WalkMe was about 1,000 people at the time, and here's Nestle with 300,000 people. Trying to figure out how a company like that works, and I'm still, I've been here 3.5-ish years, and I'm still very much a novice in understanding the inner workings of something so large. And so what I thought was going to be like, oh, it's going to be easy to come in and like build like a center of excellence or something like that, was it actually became more of me having to create a marketing strategy. How do you get people to actually even know we exist, that our application has use cases that we can deliver value on? And so like I kind of had to pivot from thinking of just, digital adoption and what WalkMe content stuff to how do we reach people? Like, and then who are these people that we need to reach out to? Like, who are the stakeholders that own these applications that are important to Nestle? And going back to where we started, like, how does Nestle work? Like how, and when a little surprise is that, IT, the whole purpose of IT at Nestle is to literally support the business. Obviously that should make sense. However, that also means we're kind of in a bubble of how the actual business side of things is run. And so even just figuring out who to talk to is very difficult because we don't necessarily know the right people or know the end users really of these applications because they're in the business.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I mean, when we were prepping for the episode, you talked about kind of being this internal salesperson, which is sort of funny to go from, the company that builds the product to then within a company enabling that product, but still kind of selling it. Like you're still very much an evangelist of WalkMe. Talk to me a little bit about the marketing strategy. You mentioned that a few times when we were prepping, the marketing strategy of getting people bought in. What were sort of the key value propositions that you were selling? And then, you talked about that first team, that recruiting HR team that was really bought in. What did you see as the difference between teams that were bought in and teams that weren't? So there's kind of two questions in there. Your value propositions, and then like, how did it land with different teams?
To be honest, it was really rough at first. Like we didn't really have a pitch, realistically. The first question we often get is like, oh, what's WalkMe? What is digital adoption? And, the first easy, oh, it's like, we create balloon navigation to help you through a process. And like, oh, we don't want balloons. And it's like, well, if you immediately get that shut down, it's like really hard to re-engage and reopen that door. And so we had to obviously struggle and pivot and reevaluate how we would first introduce ourselves. And what we've slowly developed is more along the lines of like the therapy strategy. It's like, okay, like let's start by you telling us a little bit about your team. What is your team trying to accomplish? What sort of applications does your team use to accomplish those goals? Okay, so within those applications, what are the critical processes that people are using every day to really drive that value home? Okay, so if we were to ask one of those people using the application for those processes, what would they say is the worst part of their day? Or how could we improve or make it easier for them to complete the things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis? And so how we pivoted was, instead of having to say what we do with WalkMe, what we do with digital adoption, we start with saying like, okay, let's find some pain points that we can relate to, and then tell a story of how our application could be used or applied with whatever features to actually align with that goal. So it was more just being a good listener. Instead of trying to describe, oh, what WalkMe is, it's like, no. You tell me your day-to-day, and then we figure out if even we're a good solution for you, to be honest. Like, we don't want to be forcing this. Like, I'm not a salesperson in the sense that there's no commission here. I wish. But, my whole goal is that you see the value enough that you want to work with me. And so it was a different perspective there.
Well, and I think you also touch upon something that can be challenging with digital adoption, right? Particularly if organizations kind of look at the assets of their team as people, process, technology. a lot of teams just optimize for like people and technology to solve their problems. Like this is kind of that digital adoption, process adoption is really the problem that's often hiding in plain sight. And so it takes kind of that line of questioning that you shared to get to a place where they're like, oh yeah, that is actually a problem. At least that's what we've seen on the Tango side. I don't know if that rings true for you.
Yeah. And we kind of try to strike the balance between, we want to, we have this like little quote that, WalkMe makes technology user-friendly and users tech-savvy. And just because that we can describe that as like, yes, we want all people to be able to be trained on how to use technology. However, we also want to be continually improving technology to be more user-friendly. And that usually gets people to be like, aha, so it's not just one way. We don't need to just train people on how to use an application, but by identifying how, granted, like there's so many different types of people coming from different backgrounds, different skill sets, and for you to think that just one standard training module will be able to be perfect for every one of those people is hard to imagine. Again, it depends on your scope or how many continents, countries, languages your content might be needed to be translated to. So it's just Nestle kind of blew me out of the water with trying to figure out how to manage it all. I'm not sure if that quite answered your question though, but
no, and I think I think what you hit on, which is really important, is that like one size fits all isn't always the best approach. It does need to be sort of customized at the team level, and business process is often unique within companies, across teams, between companies. But I do want to shift directions just a little bit. You talked sort of about selling these teams. Were there common hesitations? Maybe you'd get kind of to the end of the road where, you felt like you had identified a problem with a team that you could help with, specifically WalkMe could help with. Were there any hurdles that you had to jump over? You said sometimes this was rough. What made it rough sometimes? What were those challenges that you faced?
So, and this sort of goes along with my evolution of my role. And so early on, I started as the person who actually built the content. So I'd talk to you, learn about your problems, build the content with you, and sort of, roll it out slowly like that. However, that doesn't scale. Like you can't have just one person at a company like Nestle and expect that to last very long or to, not pull your hair out. And so we eventually brought on some consultants to help with that. However, consultants cost more money. One thing when, it's my salary, nothing changes no matter how hard I work. I can build all the content in the world, but I don't cost more money. However, when you bring in consultants to help scale to the levels that are necessary at a large company, there's budget. And when you're trying to ask for budget, that's when they're asking, well, why? Like, what kind of value are you going to deliver? And again, people don't know all that you can achieve with digital adoption. They're thinking like, okay, you can create a tour. Like you can show first time user, they get to the home page, these buttons do this, done. And the issues with tours is like, okay, great day one, and depending on, the churn of a specific team, it can be reused every now and then, but the long-term value of something that's just a tour isn't there. So they're like, oh, well, you want us to pay all this money for this? This is just a nice to have. This is not, a real painkiller that's going to move the needle for us. Early on, we had to basically do a lot of the project development and the funding for these things ourselves because we needed case studies. We needed internal proof that we were able to deliver value for these organizations. And so, we can talk about helping with onboarding or support ticket reduction or process optimization, that's all we want. But until we give them, examples of where we've helped internally do this, ideally on an application similar to their own, and have shown them the value that came 3-6 months after deployment, it was really hard to get anyone to be wanting to talk to us, to be honest. And I'm happy to say that our program is about 4.5, 5-ish years old from the very, very first thing. I joined 3.5 years ago. I'm happy to say, like, the marketing side of things, the selling of the value of what we do has completely diminished. Most of the people that come to us, it's all word of mouth. They're like, hey, we saw you on this app. We talked to this guy. We had coffee and we heard a problem being solved with your product. Let's set up a call and talk about how we can work together. And it's been a complete shift, which I think a lot of it is just most people aren't convinced the first time they see something, maybe not even the second time. Like, it takes being told something by one person, hearing it from another, seeing a use case value story somewhere else for them to be like, you know what, let me give these guys a chance to see what they can do to help us achieve whatever we're trying to achieve. And that's been really cool to see happen over time. But
yeah. No, that's
it's pretty
great.
slow.
And the case studies make a ton of sense. You touched a little bit upon the metrics that you show, after that 3 to 6 month period. Can you talk a little bit about metrics, data, the role that plays in the selling process, but also, how you further justify and reinforce this product over time? Once the team's already on it, what are you showing them to say, hey, here's the value that you're capturing by using WalkMe?
So how it started was we analyzed the last, 6 months worth of projects, and we collected data on them and came up with this idea of creating a value slide. And these value slides are very simple, very straightforward. It's just like a summary of the project, which starts with, what is the situation? Like, why did you talk to them in the first place? Were they buying or migrating to a new app or dealing with a lot of support tickets, whatever that situation is? Then, the objective or what they're trying to achieve. So, like, are they trying to reduce support ticket, improve optimization, or make this one real easy step to miss in a process very obvious? It can be as very direct or very just broad, depending. And then realistically, the value. And, we break value into a couple different ways, and it really depends on the use case. And this is something that came after this. So after we created these value slides, we sort of bucketed them into specific use case packages, shall we say. So, like, support ticket reduction, or what are the other, process efficiency, or license optimization, or whatever it happened to be. And, we created these packages so that it would be easier to have individual stakeholders align with one. Because once you say the title of these packages, usually they're like, that one matters to me. I really like that topic. And for each of those packages, we have it aligned with, like, okay, so if you have, support ticket reduction, normally, your objective is to reduce support tickets. Your metric is tracking support tickets. And we need to know that you guys are doing this currently. And that helps us really realize that, like, oh, if you want to reduce support tickets, but you're not tracking support tickets, well, this is useless. Like, this isn't what we're trying to do anymore, which also had happened to us previously, that they wanted to make things easier, but not realize they don't have the metrics to even track. So anyways, we have basically 6 use case buckets that all have a breakdown between, like, an objective, a KPI, and the metrics that we're trying to measure. And then we took all of those value slides and stuck them into those, like, basically a Rolodex of demo slides. And so now we can get on a call with anyone, talk to them about, what kind of use cases are important to you, and then be like, well, check out all these examples of someone who said the same thing. And this is the sort of content we developed for them, and the sort of the value that they saw from what we had. And they're like, aha. And then, of course, some of them are still being like, we need a more specific example, but they're no longer as resistant because they see the proof, they see the other teams. They could even go talk to those teams. Everyone that we work with is internal. So, it's not like we're making people up.
So you said those 3 buckets, and I just want to reiterate that for the audience, license optimization, process efficiency, and support ticket reduction. To me, support ticket reduction feels pretty clear, right? Baseline outcome. What does that look like? What are the metrics for process efficiency and license optimization? How do you help teams measure that WalkMe was successful in those use cases?
And honestly, license optimization, I threw that one out there, but that's not one of our 6 buckets. It's something we're actively trying to pursue, because this is something that WalkMe has told us that they're able to really support. And we've been running into trouble because license optimization also needs to assume that you have the power to renegotiate contracts based on certain licenses. And at the complexity level that Nestlé has, like, when you have dozens or hundreds of roles for complex applications to figure out which roles can be cut and by who. And then, so anyway, so I don't want to dive too far
Yeah.
into
So
that one
that one would
because
almost be like IT spend, but that's a new area. Okay.
I would
Got it.
almost say hold off on trying to dive into that unless you're talking about a very simple app with a very simple amount of users and go from there. And sorry, what was the other one that you mentioned? The process efficiency. So this idea is that we want to track, and again, it's up to them, because if they're tracking essentially how fast processes are being done, are people being slowed down by tricky fields or I don't know, whatever. Maybe they don't have the information, they don't have links to the training materials. We essentially are able to create process funnels, basically measuring how long it takes them to get from A to B to C. And we are basically just giving them that data so that if they feel like people are reporting struggling on a given process, let's start tracking it. Let's create the baseline. And then we can see if by adding additional content, whether it's balloons or tooltips or just whatever piece of content, sometimes it's just making a field required when it didn't used to be required, and that used to cause a lot of rework down the road. Like a big metric with certain teams is like first time right, and there's a lot of apps that don't require certain things to be done a certain way. So ensuring that first time right percentage is really high is their metric. And so granted, that's first time right is their metric, but we link it to the process efficiency bucket, shall we say.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I like that first time right. FTR. I feel like that has like a good ring to it. You talked a little bit about how you sell these these use cases internally and how you drive impact for these teams on top of other applications, right? The success factors example, and I'm sure there's hundreds more. Maybe actually going back, since WalkMe itself is its own application, how are you also justifying the spend on WalkMe, right? Because every time you add a new team with a new application, new external consultants, like you mentioned, what metrics are you looking at to say like, hey, this digital adoption solution is actually driving the impact that we had hoped it did?
This is a really good question and tough because, as you can imagine, if you're working with a group on a specific application, they might have quite a few different use cases, and all of those use cases is valued in a way that's relevant for them. However, like the interoperability between all of these applications, all of these use cases, all of these value stories doesn't exist, to be honest. And so how do we sort of justify the cost overall to the business, which of course there's a cost having the team, the application, and all the consultants to support it. And so we've come up with a secondary value measurement. So we have, we think of this more like the micro level, the use case specific to the team. But then we also have the macro level. And so how do we accumulate all of the data across all the applications, all the users, all the interactions, and translate that into value that a senior stakeholder can be like, okay, let's sign off on more budget, sort of a thing. And that was tricky because it is 100% based on assumptions that have been verified by different levels. However, at the end of the day, it's an assumption because it's essentially saying that, and it's based on interactions. And so again, like it's basically like an interaction on a smart tip means something. It means some amount of time savings. And then you take that amount of time savings, how many interactions, multiply it by the average, salary of an employee, and you get a number. As anyone with any sort of background in data or not even could tell you that not every piece of content is equal. Not every use case is equal. How do you create an average amount of time saved for like a process that could be 2 steps or a process that is 50 steps, or if the process is helping train someone or if the process is just helping correct a field. Like, we know this is an impossible task to measure. However, given what we have, that's what we rely on. So we have a macro level number that is an aggregate of how many interactions we have with the multiplier for the content plus the salary. And then that sort of like tied in with the little individual use cases that are actually the real value. Hey, look at these 3 really amazing stories that are some of our hugest successes this year. However, to get an idea of the overall program, the value that we've delivered, we're estimating, we're taking a guess that, given some assumptions, this is a number of hours saved in the year.
Yeah. And do you have any numbers you can share that you're proud of?
Oh dear. I think last quarter we returned to the business is the language we say. It's like around 500,000 hours, which when you multiply that out, it's pretty large. But yeah, that's just our quarterly number. And honestly, we're continually trying to revamp it, because when you have multipliers as large as Nestle has, these numbers quickly become absurd. Like, people just don't believe you if you say that you're saving this much time. And then you also get people pointing out that, like, if you save someone 10 seconds, what did you actually save them? Is that 10 seconds actually productive time, or did they do something else? And so, you don't have any data to say that, like, oh, because we saved that 500,000 hours last quarter, that they actually did more. So it's tricky sometimes with these numbers, because yes, our stakeholders require us to be giving these numbers, but it's also like, sometimes when they sound so absurd, I'm not necessarily proud of them. I think the bigger pride is like held, like, we had an example of helping sustain an automation level. So basically, we have this process that should be automated. The automation is built in. However, if you have this single field, and if the field isn't perfect syntax, the automation breaks. And so that field is related to, basically, I'm just going to be very broad, a form. And that form is part of $3 billion worth of stuff happening. So, like, that little field, and like, are we responsible for all of it? No, of course not. However, the fact that we can be contributing to an automation that is affecting an insanely large number is more where we get the internal value. So, like, it's much easier to tell a story like that and be like, wow, we really accomplished something to help move the needle for the business, versus, oh, we return productive hours back to the business that we can't verify where they went.
Yeah. But at the same time, giving back more hours, I mean, that's the core of what you're trying to do, is make teams more productive, give them more time. Now, what they use that time for, like, that would be an absurd mandate for you to also figure out, right? Hey, we're going to save you time, and then let's make sure all that time is redirected in the right place. That's largely down to the team. So I think you're measuring the right things. I think you can give yourself a little bit more credit. The cost side of this, right? There's always sort of this ROI that every piece of software is juggling, right? We're giving back this many hours, but there is a cost in terms of people, which we talked a little bit about. There's a cost in terms of scaling an application, which we talked about a little bit. One thing we haven't touched on yet is also, what is the cost to teams, both your team and the internal team that you're selling to, around like implementation and ongoing support? Is that something that you're focused on? And maybe help us understand, how long does an implementation take? How much support do you usually have to provide to teams to make sure that WalkMe is successful?
We do a lot. So the implementation itself is usually pretty quick. We don't have many long-term projects. Often people just come to us with a couple small use cases and we build for that. There are some
What does pretty quick look like in terms of time?
I would say like 2 to 4 weeks, honestly. Like, because we have consultants that sort of ramp up, ramp down based on our need. Like, usually we have an engineer ready anytime they want to go, and usually we're just waiting on them to create either the process documentation or to have identified their specific use cases, or they're on holiday because we're in Europe and they just disappear for months at a time. And then we need to find a UAT group to do the testing. And then we have to make sure that the content doesn't need to be translated in 26 languages. And if it does, then we need to find people in every market to verify those languages after we have, baseline machine translation done. So again, like, it can be very quick, but once you start doing the multi-language and the localization pieces, it can really expand. So it sort of depends. And so what we do now is have groups pay for the consultants up front. So the initial phase one build is what they are scoped for, what they provide funding for, and that's great. The agreement with that is that the assumption is all content needs to be updated and maintained and checked. And so what we do internally is we have 2 all content audits per year, one in the summer, one in the winter. So basically we fund, like my personal team, we basically have our consultants go through every piece of content and validate from an analytics standpoint, from a functional standpoint, that it is looking good. Or if it's not, they give a recommendation of, oh, we need tiny little fixes, and they just handle that. Oh, we have major issues with content not being used at all, went from 100 to 0. That might have changed, or maybe the app was decommissioned, who knows? And so at that point is when we need to re-engage with the stakeholder to really see and dive in. And, with being live on so many applications, it's very hard to maintain ongoing conversations with these people. So oftentimes people have just left the team and you have to go find the person that took over for them. And it's usually not too hard, but it can be a little tricky. So what has sort of evolved in its own way from this is that, my role is sort of selling the value to new groups. Then when we get confirmation, they work directly with the consultants. And then the groups that want to sort of take it the next step and sort of be like, hey, well, we need more ongoing activity. A few of these groups have actually created their own center of excellence internally. And some of them, they work with the original consultants that we still work with. Some of them actually had their own consultants brought in. So they manage their own budget for consultants, managing the content that is relevant for them. And so beyond just selling, shall I say, to new people, it's also maintaining the governance of how do we have WalkMe across all these applications, and it looks the same, does the same, and it's not, ruining an experience for someone. So that's kind of the tricky thing we need to maintain. And honestly, why we fund these audits, because if people have a bad experience, one time, they're done. Like they don't need someone to be reaching out. Oh, no, we're better now. We're better now. Come back. Like that's not going to work. So it's a lot, but overall, we see the value of continuing and expanding. And so there's honestly not really even a question about, is it a yes or no with digital adoption? It's a let's go and find more use cases sort of scenario.
That's a great position to be in. You've talked a little bit about the external consultants, and obviously that gives you some flexibility depending on new use cases you're supporting, depending on the scope of those use cases to ramp people up and down. It just better meets the needs of the business, right? I totally get that. Did you have a point where you were deciding between, hey, do we do this external consultant thing, or do we just build out a team internally? And maybe talk the audience through kind of how you thought about that decision.
So I was against the whole idea. Honestly, at first, I'm like, no. Why would you pay some external consultant? They're only in it for the paycheck at the end of the month. We want a team internal who understands, the Nestlé processes. They understand the Nestlé politics. Why would we have consultants come in that don't have that background? And so honestly, I was against it to begin with. And, my manager at the time, she was like, trust me, you'll get to a point where it is not feasible to literally do all of the work yourself, nor to try and have, 1-2 people kind of join the team, because there will be a point in time where you need to be focusing on the strategy, the upper level conversations. You do not want to be involved in implementations. You do not want to be called up on support tickets. You want to be, able to delegate to external people to support you in these things when your time is better spent elsewhere. And I can't thank her enough for making that decision back then, because at the time it didn't really matter. But today, 3 years later, we would never be able to keep up with the sort of content that we're having, because right now, this week we have 24, I think last time I counted, projects being worked on. I don't even know. And
you have 24 projects right now concurrent.
Yeah.
And so how many consultants does that take to support?
So we ramp, I think So just the ones I work directly with, I think we have around 7 or 8. So they come in and come out based on the projects. The there's a there's 2 other consultant teams for 2 other satellite offices or satellite COEs. I think one has around 6, the other has 2 or 3. Um,
Wow. And that's all focused on enabling WalkMe within Nestle.
yeah, yeah. Honestly, which is kind of crazy to think about, like the amount of use cases, and like we are just scratching the surface. Like it's nuts. Like of course we're on like a lot of the bigger apps, but when you start thinking of like success factors, our app for pretty much all of the HR activities, and that's touching 300,000 people. And how many languages, how many markets, how many products are within that? Like, ServiceNow, for instance, I think we have 20 products within ServiceNow alone. So each of those has their own product owners and teams supporting them, and new content being rolled out, and knowledge manager trying to handle how he's going to deal with the rollout of AI and the new tools that are being provided. So like it is an insane amount of stuff that's continually happening. And like, I'm sure you're aware of how SAP just bought WalkMe, but WalkMe is putting in a lot more effort to sort of roll out content on these applications that used to be completely a no-go zone sort of thing. And like Nestle is an SAP powerhouse. Like for operations, for everything on the business side, it's SAP. And most of these applications were run on these legacy systems that we couldn't touch. And now WalkMe decided that maybe it's a good idea to work on those systems. And so the last few weeks, honestly, it's just sort of exploded with the amount of interest to try and work on these things. So it's never ending, the amount of work that comes through. And again, once you've established yourself that you can validate the reason for people wanting to work with you, now it's just sort of validating that they're ready to go, because most people get excited but they're not necessarily able to define what they want yet.
Yeah, fascinating. And you guys support right now 200 plus applications on WalkMe. Is that accurate?
So I'll give you the little dirty secret to that number. So it's 64 if it's applications with visible content, but that's also a bit of a lie, because for instance, within ServiceNow, there's, let's say, 20 applications, but we count that as one. There's many applications that have multiple teams inside that we have to support, that all different stakeholders, but from an application standpoint, we count that as one. We have last I checked was like 232 applications that specifically use WalkMe for data collection. So this was a really interesting use case because we're required to report on usage and adoption numbers for certain applications. And it was a tedious process for application owners to first learn how to use tools that are available to track usage and adoption, then to add those into a specific form and basically do this monthly process. We automated it. And so basically, we created an automation tool for them using WalkMe data, and it's saving them time. So we're seeing that as support, and it's also identifying use or applications and use cases, because now that WalkMe's there, we can start doing some process analysis and be like, hey, we have a ton of users doing this. Let's dive deeper.
But I understand where you're coming from, which is kind of like, let's get people started on whatever version of WalkMe is going to be best suited for their use case, and then eventually over time there's more use cases on those tools. I get that. What would be, let's just say in a hypothetical world, if you're enabling every application instance within Nestle, what does the scale of that look like? I mean, is it like 500 apps, 600 apps? I mean, is it less? Is it more?
So I mean, So WalkMe has this feature called Discovery. I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically they tap in and they basically scan our websites for applications. And I don't know, like, what's the difference between like an application and just a website? Like, so for instance, like Google Translate, it's its own application. However, it's this. And the thing is that we are now building on non-managed apps. And what I mean by non-managed is like Google Translate. Like Google Translate is not an approved internal Nestle translation app. So we build WalkMe content on it to redirect people to the approved application. Similarly, that's how we're handling a lot of these AI tools that pop up as we try to add in our own controls. And so this tool, it's not really separating between managed apps or anything like that, but like, in the ballpark of like 100,000 apps are potentially being within scope if someone asks for it. Granted, far less are actually in reality in scope, but sort of depends, because recently we've really been working closely with the security and compliance team. And when they realize that we can now control individuals' experiences on other applications, they basically just go out there, find applications, and send them our way.
Well, it sounds like, Matt, you've got no shortage of work to be done. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But I really appreciate you spending time with us today. We've learned a ton. I think it's just fascinating to look under the hood within an organization like Nestle and understand how they're thinking about digital adoption, how they're thinking about their applications, how they maximize their team, how they value different applications. I mean, there's a lot here for our audience to take away. So I want to thank you for that. As a closing question, we like to ask, is there maybe a hot take or a misconception that you have, or maybe that most people have, that you want to kind of call BS on about digital adoption? Maybe we touched on it already, but what's kind of your hot take on the digital adoption space, and we'll cap it off there.
Yeah, no, this is kind of a funny one. Because obviously I've been talking to people who haven't worked with digital adoption before, and sometimes this isn't a unique thing to one individual. I've heard it before, is that like, oh, so digital adoption just exists because of bad UI or bad user interface and poor training. And they're like, so if we just improve the user experience on the website and improve the training, then digital adoption isn't necessary. I just kind of stop there and think that like, you're not quite getting it. You're assuming that like every individual is the same. Every process never changes. And you're not really seeing like the full long-term evolution of applications or processes. And you're living in more of like this stagnant idea of reality. And I mean, change is increasing in speed. Like, it's not slowing down. There's nothing we're going to be able to do to take a pause on what's coming our way. And so people are hesitating on digital adoption. They're just losing time on implementing something that's going to make them more efficient in the future. So I think that's the only thing I can think of at the moment, but yeah, I hope that works.
Yeah, no, I buy that completely. I mean, I do think there are a lot of very well-intentioned product teams out there that are like, oh, like, people aren't using this thing. Let's just like, and I'm gonna diminish this, this job and responsibility, which I don't intend to do, but let's just move some buttons around and work on some new flows. And it's like, well, at the end of the day, I mean, big tech companies take this on all the time. Like, think about when Google changes the layout of Gmail. I mean, it is a months-long process to get people to opt in, to get them up to speed. And so assuming you can go ahead and just like change the UI, UX and flip a switch and then everything's fixed, that's not reality either. So I totally buy that, and good to hear you say that. But
And
Matt,
I got
thank
one more
you so
quote,
much.
actually.
Yeah, go
Just
for it.
one thing that popped up recently from our senior executives is that, for every dollar spent on software, we spend $7 on change management. And so that was something, coming from our top bosses, which is a crazy thing to consider. So
$1, yeah, gosh, etch this in stone. $1 spent on software, $7 spent on change management and enablement. Those are real numbers. Matt, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for joining us on the pod. There's going to be a lot here for the audience, and we'll keep you around. Maybe we'll bring you back for like another
episode. We just scratched the surface, so sure.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, man, and enjoy Italy in the summer.
Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.